Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. I've seen a trend in videos of late that brought to my attention something. Any number of channels putting out their list of worst U.S. presidents ever. The very real trouble I see with the entire worst president ever discussion are commentators with obvious political leanings. In fact, one I just saw a few days ago had GWB number 5 and Felon Joe was nowhere on the list. Yes, it was that bad. I mean, talk about letting your political leanings show. Now, all things considered, this cloth and stuffing prognosticator has allowed my own political leanings to show through, but what follows will be my best attempt at neutrality. In fact, my rankings of the U.S. executives that have come and gone over the course of its rich history will be based on rankings in three distinct categories: ineptitude, criminal intent, and overall lack of caring for the American people. It is on each of those three key factors that I will rate each of those that I'm about to mention, with the highest aggregate score getting my top rankings for scummiest swamp dweller of all time. And before I begin, I will state that this puppet has lived through the regimes of every U.S. president from Nixon to Carter to Reagan and on up to the present. As such, I've seen a few bad ones in my time along with a couple of good ones. And now, on with the show. And drumroll, please. My nomination for the fifth worst U.S. president of all time goes to none other than Woodrow Wilson, 28th overall, and from the Democratic Political Party, serving from 1913 until 1921. The progressive Wilson basically got the U.S. involved in World War I, instituted a military draft to send U.S. citizens to die in foreign lands. Does that sound familiar? And also started the first real federal income tax in U.S. history. All while also signing the United States of America up for something called the League of Nations, a predecessor to the United Nations that would come along after. And we all know the amount of loss of freedoms that involved in that uber-liberal arrangement eventually would lead on to. Oh, it needs to also be added that Woodrow Wilson also established the Federal Reserve, which we now know to be nothing more than a money printing facility for the executive office and a beck and call and every whim of the acting U.S. presidents to come later. Wilson even set up his own propaganda division called the Committee on Public Information, which served nothing more than the purpose of forcing patriotic messages upon the U.S. public relative to the need for the United States to be involved in World War I. To counter disloyalty to the war effort at home, Wilson pushed through Congress the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 to suppress anti-British, pro-German, or anti-war statements. Wow. Oh, one last item to mention. It needs to be stated that old Woody also strongly opposed women's right to vote, or suffrage as it was commonly called at the time. As you can see, Wilson had big control issues and led the United States down dangerous pathways that would also be copied by copycat tyrants in decades to follow. Scores for Woodrow in each of the three grading categories. For ineptitude, Wilson garners a 4 out of 10. For criminal intent, I give him a 5 out of 10. And finally, for overall lack of caring for the American people, Wilson gets a 9 out of 10. Okay, on to number 4 out of the top 5 worst U.S. presidents of all time according to this puppet. And that would be none other than George W. Bush, or GWB as he is commonly referred to. Yes, viewers, the 43rd United States president, who served from 2001 until 2009, makes the 4th worst place of all time according to all that this puppet has seen, witnessed, and otherwise experienced. We're to begin with the misdirected, quote, leadership of Bush the Jr. Well, it all began on September 11, 2001, when Muslim monsters decided to commandeer commuter airline flights for nefarious and lethal purposes. Then we have the now infamous video clip whereby GWB was in a classroom at Emma E. Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida, and is whispered to about the Muslim attacks on the United States. From that point, my viewers, it was all downhill with GWB at the helm. You had the worst atrocity of civil rights upon U.S. citizens ever schemed up, the Patriot Act. We're still suffering greatly under the seemingly eternally lasting effects of that illegal piece of legislation to this day. You had Bush's Vice President Dick Cheney conspiring with his cronies at Halliburton to push propaganda upon an unwitting American populace to sell a completely unnecessary war in the Middle East. Then they claimed that Saddam Hussein, leader of Iraq at the time, had possession of fictitious weapons of mass destruction and onward marched U.S. troops into Iraq to hunt him down. And lastly, we had the financial collapse of 2008, an event that led to massive worldwide pain and suffering. Yes, Ron Reagan started it all with his major deregulation of banking institutions in the 1980s, but GWB and his henchmen got swiped by this massive rig and had absolutely no clue whatsoever what just hit them or how to deal with it. So where do we put GWB in each of the three grading categories on this one? For ineptitude, I give him a 6 out of 10 score. For criminal intent, I give him a 4 out of 10. And finally, for overall lack of caring for the American people, Bush the Jr. gets an 8 out of 10. Where are we at now? Oh, that would be the third worst U.S. president of all time, folks. That has to be Andrew Johnson. Yep, good old Andy was Abraham Lincoln's vice president and ascended to the U.S. presidency upon the former's assassination in 1865. But Johnson was by no means a chip off the old block of Lincoln, as the American public would soon become keenly aware of. Being the 17th president of the United States, Johnson served from 1865 until he left office in 1869. One term was more than enough for this villain. His first main duty in office was the daunting task of reconstruction of the now divided states of America at the end of the Civil War, a task he failed at miserably. First, he vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau bill that would have set land tracts aside for freed slaves and their families. Without that, freed slaves pretty much had nowhere to go, and former slave owners were most definitely not going to show them much mercy. He also did not initially back voters' rights for freed people of African ancestry, which essentially left them in limbo as far as being able to further their causes within the United States government. When the Congress passed the 14th Amendment granting citizens to blacks, President Johnson urged Southern states not to ratify it. Rating Johnson as I have prior to the other ones on this list, for ineptitude I give him a 7 out of 10 score. For criminal intent I give him a 7 out of 10. And finally, for overall lack of caring for the American people, Andrew Johnson gets a 9 out of 10 score. And now, for number 2 on the list of top 5 worst U.S. presidents ever. Who would you think, my friends? Well, that goes to one Barry Soetoro, of course. It was not even a contest. For starters, Barry was not ever a United States citizen, which in turn means he never actually served legally in the highest office in the land. Then we have to look at Barry's title of race baiter-in-chief, which he took much pride in. First, the Trayvon Martin case in Florida, a tragedy for certain, brought Barry out in full force calling for the end to racism in America. A noble wish, although his obvious anti-white leanings did nothing to affect the changes he was supposedly asking for. Then we had the Ferguson, Missouri riots and the BLM riots that came with it. Worth noting in that time was the lack of any condemnation by the race baiter-in-chief against the rioters, a trend that would later follow in the Felon Joe and Kamala era. Another low point for America during Barry's reign of terror came when his Attorney General, Eric Holder, provided thousands of free weapons and armaments to Mexican drug cartels in something he called Operation Fast and Furious. Many of those weapons were later found at bloody crime scenes. Next up for fake Pres Barry, his collusion with Hillary Clinton and CIA Director John Brennan to throw the election for Hillary in 2016. Yep, federal election interference they ran. The last straw was his serving as the actual U.S. president for the past 4 years, effectively his third term, and completely illegal. Yet, folks, Barry learned from Jeremiah Wright and the Chicago mob scene rather well. Rating Soetoro on my 3 criteria. For ineptitude, I give him a 3 out of 10 score, believing he is as shrewd as they come. For criminal intent, I give him a 9 out of 10. And finally, for overall lack of caring for the American people, this puppet gives him a 9 out of 10 score. And now, drum roll, please. The absolute worst president the United States has ever been forced to endure. Well, it was not even close, viewers. That would have to be Felon Joe, the 46th U.S. president, having tortured the American population from 2021 until almost a week ago as I make this video. Yep, you knew this one was coming. I am trying to be neutral on this. From federal election interference to banana republic kangaroo court trials to money laundering and racketeering. If it was criminal, Felon Joe was involved. From failing to protect U.S. citizens from criminal cartels coming over the southern border, to banning all petroleum drilling and acting clueless as to exactly why prices rose astronomically afterward. Felon Joe had virtually all 3 of this puppet's grading criteria off the scale. The Delaware crime boss had no shame in his game. Scoring the felon on my 3 key criteria, rating Biden as I have prior to the ones on this list. For ineptitude, I give him an 8 out of 10 score. For criminal intent, I give him a 10 out of 10 score. And finally, for overall lack of caring for the American people, Felon Joe gets a 9 out of 10 score. And finally, I should mention the honorable mentions who did not make my list. Jimmy Carter. Yes, he was inept and ran the country into the dirt, but he lacked the criminal malcontent that Johnson, Soetoro, and Biden had in spades. James Buchanan. He's the number one on many people's worst presidents list I've seen, but I put his charades below everyone on this list. Lyndon Baines Johnson. Good old LBJ. Did some pretty nefarious things during his reign, but none compared to the shenanigans of the five I've ranked here. And finally, we have Herbert Hoover. Yes, he sat by and did next to nothing as the Great Depression raged, but his ineptitude alone ranked nowhere near the criminal element of everyone else on my top 5 list. And folks, that is all for now, my loyal compadres. Good night, and sleep well.